And I'm recording, so whenever you're ready.
All right. My name is Christy Bibb. I teach at Anna H. Rockwell Elementary School, and I teach third grade. Today I read a text with my students about whether or not summer break is necessary, and they had to use evidence to defend their own opinion.
Now, so
Okay.
just get comfortable, shake
Okay.
it out. Okay, so let's start. We want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. How does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before the lesson and what will come after it?
This lesson comes during a unit on nonfiction text where students are really working to understand how to find a main idea as well as evidence and details to support it. The students in third grade are really expected to be able to hold a conversation and a discussion with each other by asking questions, sharing their own thoughts, either agreeing or disagreeing with a peer. And I found that using a topic that they are really motivated by, such as summer vacation, is a great way to get students to talk to each other and willing and engaged to participate in that type of conversation. Plus, they're also very interested in finding that evidence that will help support their opinion, because of course they feel their opinion is of course the best idea.
Great. Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of text designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, give an example of other texts that form this sequence. You want to pause?
Yeah, this one.
I'll read it again and then.
Okay.
Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of text designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, give an example of other texts that form this sequence.
I picked this particular text to use today because I wanted students to have a topic that really got them fired up and interested in having a conversation. This is day 3 with this particular text, other than this series of lessons where students were finding the main idea and details to support it, and then today stating their own opinions. I have not used this particular text. I have, however, used other opinion text before, and I did notice that my students responded very well to these opinionated ideas, and they were definitely engaged in prior lessons, which is part of why I picked this particular text today. It also challenged students to really think about their ideas and whether or not they needed to change their opinion. They really had to be open-minded as they worked together today, because you can't always stick to your idea if thoughts and opinions come about that you realize challenge your line of thinking. So students really had to be open to that.
Good. Talk about the standards targeted in the lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of the standard?
The standards that I addressed today really were those literacy, language, arts, and listening and speaking standards. I really wanted students to be able to demonstrate that they understood what the text was saying, be able to explain their thoughts and opinions using that text evidence. I also wanted students to be able to build upon each other's thinking. That was part of that conversation expectation. And I just lost my train of thought here. I also wanted students to be able to share their thoughts in complete sentences by either saying something like, I agree with so-and-so because, or I disagree with so-and-so because, and really using those complete sentences instead of jumping in with a thought.
Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies and why?
I really think that core action 3, where students are really set to action based on how I've set them up to have a conversation, is something that was really exemplified in this lesson, because this whole lesson was surrounding student conversation. There wasn't as much teacher-directed pieces as the lessons that came prior, where we were looking for the main ideas and the details to prove it. Yeah. can I look at the?
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to talk more about that? We're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Well, Shift 1 really requires students to be involved with reading nonfiction text, which this most definitely was a nonfiction opinion text. Students really had to use their reading skills to comprehend what the author was trying to say. This text was challenging. It would be a Lexile somewhere between the 500 and 700 level, which is appropriate for my third graders at this point in the year. They really had to work through this lengthy text, which is definitely a shift from what we've done in the past. In the past, I may have used a challenging text like this for my more advanced readers. However, I think challenging students with this complex nonfiction really gave them a lot more information and meat to discuss in their groups, instead of using a more basic article that doesn't have as many discussion points. Shift 2 really asks, hang on one second. Okay. Shift 2 really requires students to explain their own thinking while using that text-based evidence. Students today in their discussion were required to use that text-based evidence. A lot of times students enter third grade in particular really wanting to share their opinion, but not necessarily base it off of any type of factual information. So this lesson really required them to move beyond just sharing what they already had in their own heads about whether or not summer break should be longer or shorter. They really had to go back and look at the author's reasoning and justify why that now proves their own opinion. So that would be one way that it was showing that second shift. The third shift really pushes the kids to use that academic language and vocabulary, and the students did have to work through that as we read the text in the first couple of days, and we're looking for the big ideas from the author along with the evidence. And then they have to incorporate that into their arguments as they talk as a group and as a class.
How did you teach the content of this lesson prior to the CCSS? What's the same and what is different?
I think one of the biggest differences in how I would have taught this type of lesson in previous years before the Common Core would be that I wouldn't have necessarily used a text that was this complex and lengthy for third graders to discuss as a class. I may have saved that for a more advanced group of readers, but I have found that my kids have really risen to the challenge and really took to this type of text and really got themselves involved with it and looking for that evidence. So I think it has been a really good change because the kids are held to that expectation and they're reaching it.
Student engagement is crucial to the work of the CCSS. We want to understand how you ensured that all students had the opportunity to productively engage in the work of the lesson. How did you support all students in working with grade level texts? For example, how do you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read grade level text?
One way that I scaffolded some of my readers who have a bit more of a challenge with complex text like this was that I actually met with them as a small group prior to the lesson. So that way they could become more familiar with the text in a smaller setting with me to guide them through it a little bit more than is possible during an entire class lesson. So they were able to read, discuss, ask questions. We talked about more of the vocabulary words that were involved in the text. And they seemed to be very engaged in their group discussions today. I did not notice a difference between their participation and my students who were not part of that small group. So I think that prior discussion really helped them feel confident enough to participate with the rest of their peers. One of the things that I did to make sure that all of my students were engaged was to pick a topic that I knew they would be excited to talk about. And of course, you know, for kids, what's more exciting than summer vacation? So they feel very strongly about it coming into the article. And coming out the other end, I had some students who really changed their opinion. So I think text selection and topic is one of the biggest ways to make sure students are engaged. As I walked around the room, if I noticed that a student was not participating or seemed to have lost track of their group's discussion, I pulled them back in by asking a question or asking them to, go back to their work that they had done the prior days with their notes to see if there was anything they wanted to share or add. It's really just making sure that all the kids are there, redirecting when necessary, and making sure that you have something they'll be interested in. Then you don't have to intervene as many times to get them back on track.
Continuing on that question a little bit, how did you create opportunities for the students who are advanced to engage more deeply with the grade level text?
My students who are more advanced are really able to understand and decode text very well. Sometimes it's still a challenge, and it was a challenge with this text, even for them, to be able to go into it and really find the evidence that supported their thinking. So they may have pulled out evidence, but it may not have been a direct match for the argument they were trying to make. So I think pulling out information that they weren't familiar with was a challenge for them, regardless of them being able to decode accurately on their own. I also was able to challenge them with my questions as I went around to the groups to push their thinking further. I kind of listened for a minute and gauge where they are in their discussion and intervene with questions as necessary. I had one group I actually didn't intervene with as much with my questions because they were questioning each other on their own, so they didn't need as much guidance. So a lot of it is based on what the kids are doing at that particular moment on that particular day during that discussion.
How do you know that students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision?
I was able to figure out that kids were responding accurately to those text questions because I did notice that kids went back to the evidence they had highlighted or had pulled out into their graphic organizers to defend their thoughts. If they weren't, when prompted, they were able to do so. I also think that the kids were able to provide that text-specific evidence because they had done so much work with the text ahead of time. They weren't expected to immediately understand and have a discussion. They had had some time to sit with the text and really think about it. I'm trying to think if there was something else I wanted to say there. I was in the middle of a thought and then I lost it. I lost what it was. Did I answer, do you think, sufficiently enough?
Yeah,
okay.
The next kind of runs into it. Did students acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson? What did you do for the students who did not acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson?
I think a majority of my students are in the process of acquiring those literacy skills in terms of conversation. I think a lot of them at this point in time are still relying on those discussion cards, which is okay. At the beginning of the year, many of them still struggled even to use the cards to continue a conversation by asking questions, adding on to someone's thought, or disagreeing with someone respectfully. But I noticed today a lot of my students were using them well. I do have a handful of students who are able to do so without the cards. I notice in lessons where we're doing a whole class discussion, they may not need the cards and they will use those stems. I agree with so-and-so because, or well, I disagree with you because of this. So I've noticed that the discussion skills are coming a long way. We're not there yet, and they're not completely independent yet, but we're moving in the right direction. In terms of students who are not quite there yet, I did have a few who I notice are still reluctant and hesitant to share in groups. As we move forward, I will continue to scaffold their discussion strategies by using those cards further and giving more modeling in my small group guided reading lessons where we can focus on that with those students who need it. I noticed that many of my kids are also able to add evidence from the text One of the pieces that's still sometimes a struggle is putting it into their own words. I did notice some students were able to challenge a peer and say, well, what does that mean? Or what do you mean by that? When a student quoted the text and did not explain their thinking behind that quote. And I think, again, with time, practice, and modeling, the students will get there. And again, I've seen that improvement already. And as we continue incorporating these Common Core expectations and shifts, the students will continue to improve. It's still new, and we're still working through it, but we're moving in the right direction.
Reflecting on the lesson, what worked particularly well, and what might you do differently?
Thinking back on how the lesson went today, one thing I think worked well was using the color coding strategy when we highlighted on the previous 2 days of lessons. They were able to locate their evidence quickly because they knew, for example, that maybe they had highlighted things that proved summer break as it is, as an 8-week break, was fine, may have been highlighted in yellow. And then ideas that proved the opposite point, that maybe a long break wasn't the best idea, maybe they highlighted those things in purple. I think that color coding strategy worked very well and helped them with their discussions today. And I think one thing that I might do differently in the future, and one thing I will need to address, a couple of students with the discussion cards decided to be waving them in the air instead of asking a question, they would wave the question card in the air. So maybe reviewing some of those rules and expectations in terms of the classroom routines with the cards is necessary for a couple of kids.
And then, were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
Well, one of the unexpected behaviors from my students, I had a group who was waving the cards around in the air instead of just interjecting with their opinions or thoughts and taking turns. Another thing, I had a couple of students who get fidgety throughout the day and needed a couple reminders, but that's typical of a third grade classroom. Not sure if there's anything else. It's like, I mean, everything I saw was typical, like nothing.
Right.
I mean, in terms of their behaviors.
Right. I mean, I thought they were.
They really did a nice job.
Well behaved.
That's what I mean. I'm like,
Yeah, that's fine.
okay.